is it?
That's Stephen.
So it's time to ask James anything
Anything
about environments.
Yeah, because I am Mr. DevOps. I'm not. Because of the test lab, I set up environments quite often, and it's one of the things that turns up when I've talked to testers and when I've been testing forever is how do we set up an environment? And it's all got a lot simpler in the last few years.
You'd hope so.
Well,
in theory.
Yeah, all right, in theory, but in practice of setting up a test lab, it has got simpler. My life is easier now. So that's why we're asking me anything about environments, so I can bring some of that to the table.
So what sort of environments are you building in your test lab?
Generally, we're talking about at least one web server. So we're saying here is somebody else's software that runs somewhere on the internet, and it used to be that we would have to install that on a machine and then put the machine into a suitcase and bring it. And we don't do that anymore. We put it in the cloud. So we spin up a DigitalOcean droplet. And it used to be that we would spin up a DigitalOcean droplet, or we'd spin up an AWS instance, and then you'd log into that. And once you'd logged into it, you would read the install manual and you'd go through the installation. Then you'd find something wasn't quite right. And then you'd end up trying to debug somebody else's computer in somebody else's environment for a system you didn't know. And this happens to testers because we get given this stuff. You know, can you set this up? Well, am I going to talk to the devs about this? Am I going to do it myself? What am I going to do? Now what we do for Test Lab is we spin up a DigitalOcean droplet or an AWS instance or whatever else, and then we go off to a package manager and you say, yes, I'll have that please, and you press a button and there it is. And more recently we've got stuff like Docker, where you say, I've got a really basic DigitalOcean droplet Amazon instance, I will put Docker on it and then I'll slide various containers from Docker onto that, and that'll work because I don't have to configure the machine. I'm getting a container that somebody has configured for me, effectively running like a little virtual machine on the environment. And that's been a big change to us in the test lab, and I think it's a big change as in terms of when people ask me questions about how do I set up environment this, how do I set up environment that, I can't say that I'm going to have an answer for everything, but it's changed for me. The most recent thing has been Ansible and Kubernetes. I don't know. Does anybody know how to pronounce Kubernetes? Kubernetes? Okay, no. It's Google, as we know, run lots of computers. And so they took their things that allow them to provision vast services across many crappy servers, and they made it into Kubernetes or Kubernetes. And they say that it isn't quite what they use, but they've learnt from what they use, and it's even better.
Okay.
They would say that.
They don't use it.
We don't use it. But it's, so let me just drag back a bit to the Ansible world. We're talking about managing an environment as code. So one of the things you can do with code is you can check it in, and you can use it, and then when you change it, you check it in again. It says, well, this is how it changed. This is how what you did changed. And you manage environments as code, and that's what it tells you about your machines. You're not working with great big iron and somebody sat there scratching their head going, what did I do last time? Every time you touch a machine, you're touching it through the mechanism of a script, through the mechanism of code. So you grab hold of a basic system that looks like every other basic system because it's actually a virtualized system. And then you say, I'll run this script on it. I didn't do quite what I wanted, and you kill the computer, and you change your script, and you run up another one, and you run the script again, and you go, that's a bit closer. Ansible's got this idea of something being idempotent. Have we come across idempotency?
Yes.
Oh, we've all come across. Oh, well, yeah, okay. So idempotency. Can you explain it succinctly?
Yeah, basically.
I'm not sure.
The idea is if you perform an action on something and it changes, and you perform the action on it again, it shouldn't change. That you can keep applying the same action, and the thing doesn't change.
So if I slap you once in an idempotent way,
yeah, you could
I
slap
don't
me forever and it doesn't hurt anymore.
Yeah. So that's the idea of idempotency. And so Ansible scripts, for instance, are idempotent. So you sit there and you go, here's my environment, I shall run a thing, and it sets something up, and you're not quite there. So you add a bit to your Ansible script, and you run it again. Because it's idempotent, it effectively, when you say start up this service again or do this bit of configuration again, well, it doesn't do it again if it's already been done. So that's great. It means you can iteratively build up this script without having to flatten everything every time. So that's something that I've enjoyed working with Ansible, is getting all these environments into code and being able to manage that as code and being able to write it as code and being able to think, okay, well, let me get hold of provision some stuff. Now I need to get hold of those IP addresses. It goes back into whatever I'm working with, but I don't now have to think about the IP addresses because I've got a piece of code in my environment as code that gets hold of the IP addresses, that gets hold of the configuration information that I need that's generic, and then plugs that into the scripts that I'm building things with. So I'm finding that very useful.
So if people are working with their systems at the moment,
Yes.
how would they know whether they should go and look up the Ansible documentation or the Google documentation or the Docker documentation for their system?
I'm working with, and lucky man, I get to work with other people's systems. If somebody's working on a system that they've built themselves, they may find there is no Ansible documentation or anything else for their system.
So how would they know whether Docker was the right technology or Ansible was the right technology?
I don't know. I'll tell you how I know which is the right technology. If I'm building a server from scratch, I find it easier to work with Ansible because Ansible builds me a server and I can get into that server and I can say, where are your logs? It's just a standard server. If I'm using Docker, Docker works in a container, and the container is a virtual environment. And I have to squirrel into that container to go and get anything. I've had problems with Docker in the past with being able to SSH in to these environments to get anything out, particularly if Docker itself is running in a virtualized environment, which it is on a Mac. So I find Docker harder to work with. But then we get round to Kubernetes, or Kubernetes, which insists on Docker. Now, again, like Ansible, like Docker itself, and Ansible and Docker are different things. You're running your you're building your environment as code, but Kubernetes is a complicated old thing that says, well, I've got all these services that I'm responsible for, and it happens that if you've got a bunch of services that it's responsible for, and one of those services dies off, it'll just spawn another one, which is cool. I ran something up the other day which had a bunch of services on it. One of them was a web front end. I killed that. The web front end came back in a second, as far as I could tell. It was back immediately, and it was running on a different instance in my cluster. I killed off the MySQL container, the thing that had my database in it, and as far as the web front end could tell, there was no difference. It just kept on going the whole time, and all the data that was in the instance that I had killed was in the instance that Kubernetes brought up again. So I was kind of pleased with that, and I don't know. So that's something for me to go. That's something for me to go and look at. So that might give you an idea about how one picks these things. If I'm building something as a server that I want to get into, I would probably use Ansible. If I was using somebody else's stuff to get a bunch of servers up that I know and recognize, I might go into DigitalOcean or AWS and use one of the images, the turnkey images that's already there. And in fact, we've done that for Black Ops workshops, and I do it for the test lab. I might decide to run up a basic thing and put Docker containers on, because there's loads more Docker containers than there are turnkey images.
Yep.
And then the final bit, if I wanted something that was resilient and performant and production-like, I might start going and looking at Kubernetes and specifically add a tool called Rancher, which gives you a nice visual front end to these things. Now, that's not to say that one always needs a visual front end, but sometimes you don't want to be thinking, what on earth is the syntax of that? You want to press a button and say, I'd like this with the syntax in, and then please export me all these things that I should have been able to type in and couldn't, so I've got a background to it. So that's where I would use Kubernetes.
So Docker's pretty
Yep.
vendor agnostic.
Yep.
Kubernetes is Google.
Kubernetes is good. Docker is made by Docker. Kubernetes is made by Google, but doesn't need to run on any kind of Google hardware.
Okay. And Ansible.
Ansible's Red Hat, I think.
Right.
I think Ansible is made by Red Hat.
And so you can build Ansible offline, then
Yep.
push it off to some hosting service.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, with Docker, if you start up, let's say, a DigitalOcean Droplet or AWS instance with Docker on it, which is just a question of what shall I start today? Shall I start a bare thing or something with Docker on it? Then it's got Docker there. And you go into Docker and you run a Docker command, and Docker goes off to its repositories and it gets everything it needs. And suddenly you've got this web service there waiting for you. So that, it's made a big difference to me. And I think it makes a big difference I think it will make a big difference to testing things that I'm involved in, knowing that I can pretty much stand up any kind of virtual machine that I want to within certain limits and be able to deploy a service on that reliably. I'm not constantly hacking around with stuff and then going, I can't let this go down because I don't know how to bring it back up again. It makes it much more, I think, you might use the word fungible. Everything is interchangeable.
Which no one else uses the word fungible.
Yes, it's an Allen word. So I think it's a useful thing to have around, and it's really changed how I run the test lab. And so I can imagine that that's going to have a similar effect when I'm doing more testing stuff and I'm on the DevOpsy side of that. There we are. That's environments.